Did you know that up to a third of all African people who were brought over to America as slaves were actually Muslim? You see, in 1453, the Ottomans captured Constantinople, securing Europe's main trading hub with the East and becoming the middleman of European trade with India and China. In response, the Portuguese sailed south, trying to find a sea route around Africa that could allow them to trade with India directly, circumnavigating the Ottomans and the rest of the Muslim world. In preparation for the new exploration, Pope Nicolas V wrote a papal bull in 1455, legally granting Portugal the right to enslave any and all people they encountered in the west coast of Africa. Soon they began setting up trading posts with the locals where they would purchase some slaves and send in soldiers to kidnap and enslave others. But what they were surprised to discover was that many of the people living there in West Africa were actually Muslim. You see, in the 1400s, the major superpower in West Africa was Mali, a Muslim empire that was famous for its wealth, power, and sophisticated Islamic scholars. This was the kingdom of the famous Mansa Musa, who was thought to have been one of the richest people to have ever lived. In addition to this, there were many other Muslim tribes and kingdoms, including the Wolof Empire, the Fulo Empire, Bornu and Kanem empires, and later the Great Songhai Empire. Raiders from the neighboring tribes often kidnapped Muslims from these lands and sold them to the Portuguese in exchange for money and weapons. And as the New World was being discovered and colonized further west, more European nations became involved in buying slaves from Africa and selling them on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. In 1619, the first slaves arrived in the British colonies of North America, with 20 and odd slaves landing at Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. Under the British, there was a steady increase in slavery sent to the colonies each year until those colonies finally won their independence in 1783, ending the Revolutionary War. Under the newly independent American government, the early 1800s saw a huge spike of slavery in America, eventually culminating in nearly 500,000 slaves being brought to the U.S. in total. Of these, the largest number of slaves came from Senegambia, a region with an extremely rich history of Islamic civilization. In 1730, the Muslim prince Ayuba Suleiman Diallo was kidnapped and sent to Kent Island, Maryland, to work the tobacco fields. He was a scholar and a hafiz of the Quran, and he even wrote 3 copies of the Quran by hand from memory while enslaved. He was later sold to a wealthy lawyer in England and was given the Bible in Arabic to read, hoping that he would convert to Christianity. But after reading the Bible, Ayuba pointed out that there was no Trinity mentioned in the book, and he said that he considered the Christian belief to be incompatible with monotheism. In 1752, Yarrow Mamout, another educated Muslim, was kidnapped and sent to Annapolis, Maryland, where he worked on a plantation. When the owner there learned that he could read and write, he was brought in to work as a personal servant, becoming a jack of all trades. Eventually, after 44 years of slavery, his master died and he was set free. He then saved up enough money to buy his son's freedom and later became a successful investor and entrepreneur. Even at an old age, he was known for praying frequently and never touched alcohol or pork. In 1788, Abdurrahman Ibrahim Asori, yet another Muslim prince and military commander, was shot and captured during a battle with another tribe before being sold as a slave and taken to Natchez, Mississippi. During his time in America, he feigned joining the Baptist church and married a Christian woman, but refused to participate in anything that went against Islamic teachings. Soon after, he managed to gain his freedom before eventually boarding a ship that was sending freed slaves back to Africa. And it was said that as soon as he got in sight of Africa, he stopped pretending to be a Christian and professed his full faith in Islam once more. And finally, in 1807, Umar ibn Sa'id was captured during a military conflict and sent to a cruel master in Charleston, South Carolina. He had been a student of knowledge who had spent 25 years of his life studying with Muslim scholars, and when he arrived on the plantation, he managed to escape, eventually ending up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. There, he was captured and put in prison before being sold to another plantation owner. He was then gifted a Bible in Arabic, and his owner thought that he might actually have converted to Christianity. But when he eventually died, it was discovered that he had written dedications to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in his Bible in Arabic, and on a card that was found, he had written Surah Al-Nasr, a surah which refers to the conversion of non-Muslims to Islam in multitudes. On the other side of that card, however, someone had written the Lord's Prayer in English, having thought that the Arabic writings were actually a verse from the Bible. As it turns out, he had never actually left Islam after all. These are only a few stories we know of the potentially more than 100,000 stories of Muslim slaves that we don't know. Throughout the history of slavery in the US, Muslims had a profound influence on the plantations, owing to the fact that, generally speaking, the Muslims could read and write and were educated, while even the plantation owners themselves often were not. One plantation owner from Sapelo Island, Georgia in particular, bought at least 80 Muslim slaves as he saw them as extremely hardworking and well-educated. There, a Muslim slave by the name of Bilali Muhammad was the imam for the Muslims, teaching them Quran and leading them in prayer. When he died, it was found that he had written a 13-page manuscript on Islamic law known as the Bilali document. And while the Muslims of Sapelo Island were able to maintain their Islam, very rarely were they ever able to pass it on. There was a huge gender disparity in the slave communities, with many more men enslaved than women. Many Muslims were unable to get married and have children to teach Islam too. And even if they were able to get married and were able to have children, those children were often separated from their parents or sold to other plantations. There were no proper schools, kids were often forced into Christianity, and grandchildren often never even knew that their grandparents had been Muslim. In their ignorance, some of them even assumed that they had been worshipping the sun and the moon because they prayed at dawn and dusk. And because of that, it is said that the last Muslim slaves passed away in the 1920s, and not a single Muslim community remained from the slaves brought over from Africa. The legacy of the Muslim slaves had been completely erased. Nothing was left behind. Except that's not entirely true. You see, in 1913, just as the last Muslim slaves were dying out, a man named Timothy Drew founded a black nationalist organization called the Moorish Science Temple of America. The term Moor came from the white slave masters who used to call the Muslims Moors rather than Africans, since in their racist ideology, Africans were incapable of being educated. Timothy Drew believed that the African Americans were all Muslim Moors descended from the ancient peoples of Morocco, and that they should return to the Islam that the white man had taken from them. But in his warped version of Islam, he claimed to be a new prophet, and he began calling himself the Noble Drew Ali. Eventually, one of the members of the Moorish Science Temple split off from his organization, creating his own in 1930 called the Nation of Islam. He too claimed to be a prophet of Allah, but after his sudden disappearance, his successor claimed that he had actually been God in human form. Soon, other black nationalist groups began appearing, each claiming to be the true representation of Islam brought over by their enslaved ancestors. The El Rukna tribe emerged from the Moorish Science Temple, becoming Chicago's most powerful and sophisticated street gang. The 5% Nation split off from the Nation of Islam, claiming that all black people were part of a race of gods on earth. These organizations and many others spread across the black communities of America, and their influence became especially clear in the jazz and hip-hop scenes. Many musicians and celebrities began joining these organizations, claiming to have converted to Islam, even if that couldn't have been further from the truth. But out of all of this, one man appeared who would change everything. He had joined the Nation of Islam and believed that the white man was the devil and that the black man was the inheritor of the earth. But when he finally made his journey, traveling across the world to Mecca for Hajj, it soon became clear to him that all he knew about Islam had been a lie. He then truly converted to Islam, and after being a Muslim for less than 1 year, he was assassinated. But his sacrifice wasn't in vain, as eventually the Nation of Islam would follow in his footsteps and be completely transformed. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans would convert to Islam, reviving the legacy of their enslaved ancestors before, all thanks to one man who had given everything up for his people. His name was Malcolm X. Like and subscribe for more Muslim Facts.
Takbir. Allahu Akbar. Takbir. Allahu Akbar. Takbir. Allahu Akbar. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum assalam.